Welcome, traveler of time, to another journey into the shadows of history. Tonight, we drift into a world where law was young, danger was everywhere, and justice rode on horseback. This is not the Hollywood Wild West. This is the real one. A place of dust, gunfire, greed, courage, and madness. A frontier where bounty hunters hunted the hunters, outlaws gambled with fate, and entire towns prayed that justice would arrive before death did. Settle in, the trail ahead is long, bloody, and unforgettable. Let the story begin. In the dusty heart of the American frontier, long before highways and skyscrapers, before radio signals crossed the sky or electricity lit the night, there was a world unlike anything we recognize today. A world shaped by sand, sun, horses, and the constant echo of gunfire. The Wild West was not a legend when it was born. It was a harsh, living reality. The air was dry, the land was unforgiving, and every step across that open desert carried the weight of danger. Imagine wide plains stretching farther than the eye could see, broken only by jagged mountains, silent canyons, and thirsty rivers. Imagine days where the sun burned the earth until it cracked, and nights so cold that even the toughest cowboy shivered under a blanket of stars. This was not a place built for comfort. It was a place carved out of survival. Every man who rode through these lands knew that life was fragile and death traveled close behind. In small towns scattered across the frontier towns made of dusty roads, wooden saloons, and a church that doubled as a courtroom, fear lived quietly in every doorway. There were no professional police forces, no trained detectives, no government strong enough to protect every ranch, every bank, every family. When trouble came, it came fast and violently. A gang of outlaws could ride into a town and take everything, money, horses, lives, and vanish into the desert before sunrise. And the people left behind had no power, no justice, and no hope of chasing them. That hopelessness became the seed of something dangerous, because when law fails, desperation invents new solutions. The American frontier turned to a simple idea. If criminals could not be stopped by law, then law would pay anyone brave or foolish enough to stop them. Gold, dollars, land, or supplies would be offered as a reward. It didn't matter who the hunter was. It didn't matter what kind of past they carried. All that mattered was that the outlaw was brought in, and so the first bounty posters appeared. One sheet of paper, one crude drawing, one name, one price, wanted, dead or alive. Those 4 words changed everything. They created a new kind of warrior, men who weren't sheriffs, weren't soldiers, and weren't saints. They were bounty hunters. Ruthless, desperate, dangerous, and deadly. They rode into the wilderness where no sheriff dared go. They tracked criminals across desert sands, freezing mountains, swamps, and ghost towns. They hunted killers, robbers, train bandits, horse thieves, escaped prisoners, and anyone the law stamped as dangerous. But this story doesn't begin with bounty hunters. It begins with chaos. The Wild West was born after the Civil War, when thousands of men returned home to find their farms destroyed, their families broken, and their lives shattered. Some went west for a fresh start. Others went west to escape the law. In the growing towns of Texas, Kansas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California, guns became the final judge. If 2 men argued in a saloon, one ended up on the floor. If a rancher refused to sell his land, someone burned it. If a bank had gold, someone planned to steal it. Every day was unpredictable. One morning you could drink whiskey with a stranger, and that same night he could stab you for your horse. There was no safety. There was no certainty, and people lived every minute knowing danger was always close. Sheriffs tried. Some were brave, some were drunk, some were corrupt. A sheriff in a small town might have 1 or 2 deputies, and together they faced gangs of 10, 20, maybe 50 armed outlaws. The badge on their chest was not a shield, it was a target. When a sheriff confronted a notorious gang leader, it was often the sheriff who ended up in a pine box by sunrise. The government, distant and weak, sent laws on paper, but paper didn't scare men with rifles. So townspeople took justice into their own hands. Vigilante groups formed, farmers, ranchers, storekeepers carrying pitchforks and old shotguns, chasing criminals through the night. Sometimes they caught the right man. Sometimes they killed an innocent one. The West was law, but it was not justice. It was order, but never peace. Then came the idea that would reshape everything. If brave men wouldn't volunteer to chase criminals, money would make them. A cash reward was the spark that turned ordinary men into hunters. These bounty posters were nailed on doors, traded in saloons, whispered in smoky card rooms, and carried on trains from one state to another. Some offered $20, some offered $500, and for the most dangerous men, the kind who robbed trains or burned towns, the price could climb to thousands. For a hungry man in a harsh land, a bounty wasn't just money. It was survival, the difference between starvation and life, between sleeping under the open sky or owning a piece of land. Soon, the frontier changed. Every outlaw knew that somewhere, someone was hunting them. Every bounty hunter knew that one mistake meant death. Every town knew that justice was no longer delivered by the law. It was purchased with gold. But there was something darker hidden beneath those posters. Something brutal, something unspoken. The words dead or alive meant something very clear. If a bounty hunter could not catch a criminal alive, killing him was perfectly acceptable. A corpse couldn't run. A corpse couldn't shoot back. A corpse didn't need handcuffs, food, or a horse. For many hunters, bringing a body was simply easier and safer than bringing a living man, so the West became a place where a human life had a price tag, a place where death was negotiable, a place where men hunted men. The wind carried stories of gunfights in lonely cabins, ambushes in riverbeds, and the screams of outlaws dragged out of hiding. Mothers locked their doors at night. Children whispered about shadowy strangers riding into town, and everywhere the fear grew. Convicts who escaped prison disappeared into the wild. Horse thieves became legends. Women with babies on their hips begged sheriffs to protect their homes. But sheriffs couldn't do enough. They couldn't be everywhere. They couldn't chase every killer, every thief, every runaway murderer. And so the bounty system spread. It became the backbone of frontier justice. If a man robbed a bank in Texas, there was a price on his head in Kansas. If someone murdered a family in New Mexico, posters carried his face into Colorado. Outlaws were no longer safe anywhere. Every stranger could be a hunter. Every shadow could hide a bullet. Every footstep could be the last. But the frontier was not just violence, it was also hope. For every criminal looking to steal, there were honest families trying to build. Couples planting crops, children learning to read, workers building railroads that would one day connect a nation. Churches rose on dusty roads. General stores sold flour, boots, sugar, and bullets. Saloons filled with music and laughter. And despite the chaos, America kept growing, but so did the crimes. Train companies hired guards to protect their cargo. Cattle barons hired gunmen to protect their herds. Stagecoaches traveled with men holding rifles pointed at the road. Every time a door opened, people wondered if an outlaw was about to walk in. Fear was everywhere. Suspicion lived in every handshake. A stranger could be a farmer or a killer in disguise. A cowboy could be a wanderer or a bounty hunter waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Still, the world kept moving. Day after day, the bounty system grew, and more men joined the hunt. The belief spread that anyone could become rich if they captured the right criminal. Men who had nothing but a horse and a gun suddenly imagined themselves as frontier legends. Chasing outlaws became a profession, and the West became a giant battlefield of hunters and hunted. Some bounty hunters rode with honor, trying to bring criminals in alive. Others were ruthless, not caring how much blood spilled. A few hunted the wrong people, innocent men, tricked, framed, or mistaken. The system was powerful, but it was cruel. It was the birth of the most dangerous game mankind ever created. Not war, not conquest, but the hunting of human beings. This was the beginning of the madness, not the gunfights, not the legends, not the famous outlaws whose names would echo through history. No, it began here, in these dry towns, with frightened citizens and desperate governments willing to pay for protection. The Wild West was not built on romance. It was built on survival. It was a place where every sunrise brought new risks, new enemies, new stories written in dust and blood. There were no second chances. There was no time for mercy. If a man hesitated, he died. If he trusted the wrong stranger, he disappeared. And out of this unforgiving world came the bounty hunter, a man paid by law, feared by criminals, and often hated by the very people he protected. Some called them heroes, others called them killers with permission, but whether loved or hated, one thing was undeniable: they became the final line between chaos and civilization. The dust of the frontier was not silent anymore. It carried the thunder of hooves, the crack of revolvers, and the whispers of men who hunted for gold and glory. Every outlaw who rode into the sunset knew one thing: he was being watched. Somewhere, a pair of eyes was tracking him. Somewhere, a gun was being loaded. Somewhere, a bounty hunter was coming, and the West would never be the same again. They were not soldiers. They were not knights in shining armor, and most of them were never trained for justice. In truth, they were simply men of the frontier, molded by hunger, desperation, violence, and the promise of reward. These were the bounty hunters of the Wild West, figures feared by outlaws, doubted by townspeople, and respected by no one except the men who understood how dangerous the world truly was. If you had lived in the West during this time, you would not have recognized a bounty hunter by his badge. Most of them did not have one. You would not spot them by their uniforms because they had none. You would not know them by fame because the most dangerous hunters were the ones whose names never made the newspapers at all. A bounty hunter could have looked like a ranch worker, a cowboy, a drifter, or a criminal. He might have walked into a saloon, ordered whiskey, played cards, laughed with strangers, and no one would realize he was in town to take someone away, either in shackles or in a coffin. Most bounty hunters began life like everyone else: farmers, cowboys, soldiers. Some were men who had seen too much violence and could no longer live a quiet life. Others were men who tasted violence for the first time and discovered they were frighteningly good at it. There were hunters who turned to the job out of poverty, with children to feed and debts to pay. There were men who had lost everything: lands, families, entire futures stolen by the world, and bounty hunting became their only chance to start again. And yes, some were criminals themselves, men whose hearts were as dark as those they hunted. But nobody cared about a man's past. The frontier only cared about results. A bounty hunter lived by a brutal code: find the outlaw, survive the encounter, get paid. Everything else was irrelevant. He did not need to read. He did not need to pray. He did not need to swear loyalty to any sheriff. He only needed two things: a gun steady enough to kill, and a soul cold enough to accept the weight of it. But the life of a bounty hunter was not simply about chasing men. It was about chasing ghosts. For every criminal with a face on a poster, 1,000 rumors followed him. A hunter might travel 200 miles because someone whispered, "I think I saw him near the canyon." He might spend nights in freezing mountains, sleeping with a rifle across his chest, because he believed his target was somewhere in the pines. He might wait outside a cabin for days without moving, watching shadows in the windows, waiting for the right moment to strike. They were patient men, hard men, Men who understood that one wrong move, one wrong breath, and they would never see the sunrise again. A hunter never traveled without supplies. A horse, a saddlebag, a few dollars in coins, bullets, jerky, sometimes whiskey, and always rope. Rope was not merely for tying a captured outlaw. Rope was for dragging bodies across rock, for climbing down canyons, for helping a horse survive deep mud. Life in the frontier was not glamorous. It was a daily struggle with nature itself. A thunderstorm could flood the land, lightning could spook a horse, a rattlesnake bite could end a life in minutes. Some hunters died without ever firing their guns, buried in shallow graves because nature killed them long before any outlaw had the chance. The wanted posters that listed an outlaw's crimes were often incomplete. A poster might say armed and dangerous, when in truth the man it described had killed 10, maybe 20 people and would not hesitate to kill again. Or the opposite, sometimes the poster made a criminal sound like a monster, when in reality he was just a young man who robbed a bank to feed his starving family. But once a price was set on a person's head, the hunters did not ask questions. The bounty erased morality, it erased sympathy, it erased doubt. To a bounty hunter, the world was divided into two kinds of men, the hunter and the hunted. They did not live like citizens. Citizens slept in beds. Hunters slept on rocks or against tree trunks or under wagons. They woke before dawn, saddled their horses, and rode into valleys where silence was so heavy that even the wind seemed afraid to breathe. They had to learn the land the way wolves learn the forest. They watched footprints in dust, broken branches in grass, bits of torn clothing caught on barbed wire, cigarettes still warm near a campsite. Every clue mattered, every sign could mean the difference between life and death. Some bounty hunters rode alone because trust was dangerous. A partner could turn on you for money. Partnerships ended with betrayal. There were stories, too many of them, of hunters shooting each other in the back and delivering one outlaw and one bounty hunter corpse to the sheriff, walking away twice as rich and twice as cursed. But there were also duos who became brothers not by blood but by battle, men who spent years riding side by side, saving each other's lives more times than they could count. The frontier had no rules about loyalty. A man could be your brother tonight and your coffin maker tomorrow. The weapons they carried were not elegant. A revolver jammed in a rainstorm, a rifle kicked hard against the shoulder, a shotgun scattered lead like angry bees. When a hunter fired his gun, his ears rang, his heart pounded, and for a moment the world was nothing but smoke and chaos. Gunfights were not like the movies. No heroic speeches, no noble duels at sunset. Gunfights were messy, loud, confusing, fast. A man could die before he even realized someone had aimed at him. Some bounty hunters preferred not to shoot. A living outlaw meant a higher reward. Some could be reasoned with, tricked, intimidated. A hunter might offer a cigarette, pretend to be a friend, or share whiskey, waiting for the moment his target dropped his guard. Others used trap, slurring outlaws with stories of gold, or messages written by fake friends, or fake telegrams claiming their family was sick. In the West, deception was a weapon just as sharp as any knife, and there were hunters who didn't care. They didn't want conversation. They didn't want negotiations. They wanted the outlaw dead. It was simpler that way. A corpse did not argue. A corpse did not escape. A corpse did not shoot. Every hunter had a reputation. Some were known as honorable. They brought men in alive whenever they could. They protected families. They respected the innocent. Others were known as monsters, men who shot first and searched for permission later, and some were whispered about in fear. Killers who crossed the line so many times that even criminals trembled when they heard their name. But there was one truth the frontier understood. No one becomes a bounty hunter without having darkness somewhere inside them because the job demanded it. Imagine waking up every morning knowing a man is somewhere out there planning how to kill you before you kill him. Imagine riding into towns where every stranger might have a weapon hidden under their coat. Imagine sleeping with one eye open for years, waiting for revenge to catch up. The bounty hunter did not fear death. He counted on it. He made peace with it. Some embraced it. Yet, beneath the brutality, there was a strange kind of logic. A bounty hunter might be the only person standing between a murderer and a defenseless family. He might be the only person who could track a killer across hundreds of miles when the sheriff had no idea where to start. He might be the only hope that the criminal would ever face consequences. That thin line between justice and survival rested in his hands. And whether people liked him or not, someone had to do it. When a bounty hunter rode into town, people watched from behind windows. Some locked their doors. Some whispered. Children stared with wide eyes, and mothers pulled them away. There were men who cheered, raising glasses of whiskey to salute a hunter who dragged a criminal into the sheriff's office, but the same men might curse him if he ever made a mistake. The respect given to a bounty hunter was always temporary. Admiration could turn to fear in a heartbeat, and hunters knew this. They were outsiders everywhere they went, never truly welcome, never fully trusted. A hunter lived with the understanding that his only friend was his horse, his gun, and the few coins in his pocket. Every hunter had stories. Some they told, some they buried deep in their minds where nightmares lived. They remembered gunfights where bullets ripped through the air, so loud and so close the sound never left their ears. They remembered outlaws begging for life. They remembered bodies lying on dusty roads, their blood turning the earth dark. They remembered innocent people caught in the crossfire, women screaming, children crying, men dying who were never part of the fight. But they also remembered the hunger that drove them, the sheriff's office handing them a bag of silver coins, the saloon doors swinging open as they walked in, wounded but alive, the nights when whiskey tasted better because death had lost again. And the rare moments, very rare moments, when someone thanked them, when someone looked into their eyes with honesty and said, "You saved us." But gratitude could not change a man's fate. A bounty hunter knew that the world saw him as necessary, never noble. He might bring justice, but he did it with blood. He might save a town, but he did it by killing someone else's son. And no matter how many criminals he stopped, there was always another waiting across the horizon. The job never ended, the danger never slept, the reward money did not bring peace. Some hunters grew old, though not many. Some retired to farms far from gun smoke and death. Others died alone on desert roads, their bones bleaching in the sun. Some were buried with no name, no marker, no story left behind, but there were a rare few, who became legends, men whose accuracy was unmatched, whose bravery was unquestionable, whose presence alone struck fear into the hearts of killers. They were the hunters of hunters, the men outlaws prayed never to meet. Their reputations traveled faster than their horses. Their shadows grew longer with every bounty they claimed, and in their eyes lived something dangerous, not cruelty, not heroism, but certainty. The certainty that they belonged to a world where death was part of the job. So when you think of the Wild West, do not imagine only the sheriffs with shining badges. Do not imagine the noble hero riding into town to save the day. Remember the other figure, the silent rider, watching from the edge of town with eyes that had seen too much, the man who did not wait for justice to arrive, the man who carried justice on his saddle. Because while lawmen wrote the rules, bounty hunters enforced them in the shadows. They kept order in a world where order refused to exist. They walked a tightrope between savior and sinner, hero and villain, protector and killer. And history would never be the same because of them. The laws of the Wild West were printed on paper, but the real law was written in the barrel of a gun. In courts and churches, citizens talked about justice, fairness, and trials. But out on the plains, far from polite civilization, no judge existed, no courtroom waited, and no jury cared. What mattered was survival, and survival had no patience for mercy. When a wanted poster said dead or alive, it was not a suggestion. It was a warning. It meant the government did not care how the outlaw arrived, dragged in chains or dropped at the sheriff's feet, cold and silent. A body could not escape custody, could not shoot back, could not stand trial, could not break out of jail. A corpse ended the story. That made life cheap. Some men were worth more dead than alive. Any bounty hunter who rode into the wilderness understood a simple truth. If a man resisted, a gunshot was easier than handcuffs. If an outlaw reached for a weapon, the hunter fired without hesitation. Some hunters gave warnings, some did not. A gun was the voice of reason in a world where reason rarely survived. Many hunters preferred the hunt to be quick, a bullet, a fall, a final breath, and then the long ride home with a body tied across the saddle. But the brutality was not only in the killing, the brutality lived in the road that followed. A hunter might spend days dragging a corpse through mud, snow, or burning sand. Wolves and coyotes followed at a distance, smelling blood and opportunity. Vultures circled overhead, waiting. A body in the desert could stiffen, rot, or darken under the sun. Flesh attracted insects, skin peeled. The heat turned death into something foul and heavy. The journey tested not only the hunter's courage, but his stomach and his soul. Yet the reward was real. A sheriff looked at the body, matched the face to the poster, examined the scars or the clothing, and counted out the money. Nobody asked how it happened. Nobody demanded details. Death was easier than paperwork. The frontier's most dangerous outlaws knew this. They understood that surrender was rarely an option. If captured alive, they were not guaranteed safety. Some sheriffs hated the criminals more than the hunters did. Some townspeople wanted revenge. A murderer could be taken to jail and hanged the next morning by a mob. A thief could be shot while trying to escape. A killer could be delivered alive and leave the world before the sun rose again. So criminals did not surrender. They fought, they hid, they trusted no stranger. Every knock on a cabin door might be a bounty hunter. Every rider on the horizon might be death. A man with a price on his head slept lightly, pistol at his side, horse saddled, escape route planned. He knew that someone was coming, maybe today, maybe tonight, maybe a week from now. The bounty did not expire. The hunters did not tire. The chase never stopped. And that is why violence became the language of the frontier. Picture a lone cabin in the desert. A thin trail of smoke rises from the chimney. Inside, an outlaw sits at a table, sharpening a knife, ears alert, heart hardened. Outside, a bounty hunter moves silently, watching from the brush. The hunter studies every detail, the number of windows, the position of the door, the angle of the wind. His breathing slows, his trigger finger tightens. He knows the outlaw will not come quietly. He waits for nightfall. The outlaw lights a lamp. The cabin glows like a target. Minutes feel like hours. The hunter approaches the door, gun raised, hoping the outlaw is asleep. A twig snaps beneath his boot. The sound echoes louder than thunder. Inside, the outlaw rises, grabs a gun, kicks the table over for cover. The door explodes from gunfire. Bullets tear through wood. The hunter dives aside. A second volley of shots splits the darkness. Inside the cabin, panic meets fury. Outside, silence breaks into chaos. One man will live, one will die. But whether the cabin burns, whether the bullets find their mark, whether the outlaw escapes into the night bleeding and furious, the same truth remains. The bounty must be claimed. This scene happened hundreds of times across the West, each one slightly different, each one ending with bodies. sometimes one body, sometimes two, sometimes a whole cabin of men lying in the dirt. Even when hunters approached with caution, danger found them. They entered valleys haunted by shadows. They rode through forests where every rustle could be the sound of a rifle. They walked into saloons where outlaws sat quietly, disguised, watching the door with murderous patience. The hunter never knew who might attack him, and the outlaw never knew who might be hunting him. Gunfights in the Wild West were rarely dramatic duels at high noon. They were ambushes, surprise attacks, desperate last stands. A hunter might receive a tip that an outlaw was seen in a crowded saloon. He walked in calmly, ordered a drink, scanned the room. The outlaw recognized him. Their eyes locked. Before a word could be spoken, chairs crashed, glasses shattered, people dove for cover, and two revolvers screamed fire across the smoke-filled room. The customers were not spectators. They were victims of circumstance. Innocent men were hit by stray bullets and collapsed without warning. The price of justice was paid by everyone nearby. Sometimes the hunter won, sometimes the outlaw won, and sometimes both men fell, dying on a barroom floor, the bounty lost, the reward unclaimed, and the story forgotten. There were towns that smelled of gunpowder every week, saloons with bullet holes scarred into the walls, cemeteries filled with names carved into crooked wood. Mothers prayed for their sons to return from the hunt, or for their sons to survive being hunted. Wives waited for husbands who never came home. Children grew up hearing gunshots instead of lullabies. But the dead or alive law did not exist because the frontier loved violence. It existed because the frontier hated chaos. When lawmen could not protect the people chose another path. They were willing to trade due process for survival. They believed something terrible. A dead criminal terrified other criminals. A town that accepted the corpses of outlaws would not be bothered by gangs. A message carved in blood was more powerful than a law printed on paper. And so the killing continued. Some bounty hunters became executioners. They did not hunt to arrest, they hunted to eliminate. A few were paid under the table by ranch owners, railroad bosses, or small governments. Their job was not to bring criminals to trial. Their job was to make criminals disappear. The West did not report every death. Many bodies were buried where they fell, nameless, silent, erased from history. The bounty hunter collected his money, wiped the blood off his boots, and rode to the next town. Nothing more needed to be said, but a strange thing happened in these harsh lands. The people began to admire the bounty hunters. They were dangerous, yes. They were unpredictable. They were killers. But they protected the innocent, sometimes better than the sheriff could. When a known murderer arrived tied to a horse, the town celebrated. When a feared outlaw was found dead near the river, families slept easier. The hunter became an unofficial shield, an uninvited savior. Even children grew up hearing stories of legendary hunters, men who rode like ghosts, tracked criminals like wolves, shot faster than thought. Their names traveled across the plains. Outlaws whispered them like curses. Parents whispered them like prayers. These men made the dead or alive. Law looked like destiny, but there was a darker price for this system. Some hunters began killing not for justice, not for protection, but for money alone. Why bring an outlaw in alive when a bullet paid the same? Why risk being shot or stabbed or ambushed when death was simpler? The frontier did not punish a hunter for killing a criminal. It rewarded him, and with every body delivered, the line between lawman and murderer blurred until it vanished entirely. There were hunters who staged encounters, who shot sleeping outlaws, or poisoned their food, or burned cabins with men still inside. They did not care how death arrived, only that it arrived. Their reputations grew terrifying. Even sheriffs feared them. These men were not justice. They were death with a price tag. Yet the frontier rarely questioned them. The government rarely interfered. The people rarely complained. When an outlaw disappeared, life improved. When a killer was buried, peace returned. The hunting continued, not because it was noble, but because it was effective. Still, not every hunter was heartless. Some risked their lives trying to take criminals alive. They studied psychology, watched body language, waited for exhaustion or fear to break a man's spirit. They tackled criminals, tied them up, dragged them into town bruised but breathing. Sometimes they succeeded. Sometimes the fight escalated and survival demanded a bullet. Imagine a hunter cornering an outlaw at gunpoint. The outlaw's hands shake. His face is pale. He knows the punishment waiting for him is worse than death. Maybe he begs for mercy, maybe he cries, maybe he reaches for his gun and forces a shootout. The hunter makes a decision in a heartbeat, one life spared or one life ended. That choice changes everything. But the world did not see the struggle inside the hunter's mind. It saw only the result, alive or dead, and the bounty was paid accordingly. Traveling across the frontier was a constant test of courage. A hunter rode alone through lands ruled by silence. The wind carried dust. Rattlesnakes hissed from rocks. Coyotes laughed in the night. Thunderstorms turned dry rivers into floods. Winter turned mountains into icy graves. Men froze to death in snow, drowned crossing swollen rivers, or collapsed from dehydration in the desert. Some were found years later, skeletons in tattered clothing, guns rusted at their sides, horses long gone. Nature was as deadly as any outlaw, yet the bounty hunter rode on. The reward called to him like a distant voice. His gun was his companion, his horse his partner, his instincts his only map. Every day was a gamble. Every night was a prayer that no bullet found him in his sleep. There were moments of horror too, moments where an outlaw begged for mercy, moments where a hunter questioned his own soul. Some hunters quit. Some drank until they could not remember the faces of the men they killed. Others became colder, harder, less human. The frontier shaped them the way a hammer shapes metal, stronger, sharper, and more deadly with every strike. The dead or alive, law created a world where justice walked with death, where mercy was a weakness, and where morality was a luxury almost nobody could afford. The West believed in results. If a town was safe because a criminal died, the town did not ask how it happened. They thanked the hunter, paid him, and moved on. But deep in the hearts of these men, hunters and hunted alike, there lived something darker, the knowledge that any man could become prey. Any disagreement, any mistake, any rumor could put a price on a head. Today, the hunter might deliver a body. Tomorrow, his own name might appear on a wanted poster nailed to a dusty wall. The frontier was not poetic. It was not romantic. It was not a world of clean justice. It was a world built on fear, on violence, on revenge disguised as law. And the bounty hunter was the instrument that made it all possible. They hunted men for money. They killed without hesitation. They buried strangers in shallow graves. Some died forgotten. Some became infamous. A few became legends. But the truth behind the legend was always the same. In the Wild West, death was easier than justice, and everyone knew it. The sun never cared who lived or died in the frontier. It rose without mercy and fell without apology, shining its golden light across endless plains, dusty roads, and lonely wooden towns where every man carried a secret and every woman understood fear better than peace. The West was growing, but with every passing year, outlaws became bolder, more organized, and more violent. The territories were too vast and the sheriffs too few. The law was drowning, choked beneath the weight of crimes it could not control. And in that suffocating darkness, bounty hunters thrived like wolves among cattle. By now, the frontier was not just wild, it was unstable. Stagecoaches ran with guards, trains hired armed watchmen, banks built iron vaults, and ranchers paid to protect their cattle from thieves. But no amount of protection could stop the relentless hunger of organized outlaw gangs. They were faster, crueler, smarter, and more desperate than ever before. The price on their heads rose with every crime. The higher the bounty, the more ambitious they became. After all, a man who was worth thousands was a man who could command a small army. Among the many stories of chaos in the West, one name echoed louder than most: the infamous Dalton gang. They rode through the frontier like a storm, robbing banks and trains with precision, leaving entire towns trembling in their shadow. When the government could not stop them, the posters went up, the reward grew. Men sharpened their guns and sharpened their hunger, but the Daltons were ghosts, quick, deadly, and always one step ahead. They weren't the only ones. Dozens of gangs roamed the frontier. The James Gang, the Wild Bunch, renegade armies shaped by war, greed, and despair. They attacked small towns, kidnapped wealthy settlers, stole horses, hijacked trains, and murdered men who dared to stand in their way. Every attack fed the fire. Every robbery carved fear into the hearts of families trying to build a life in the wilderness. So the bounty system became something bigger than simple justice. It became business. Serious business. The newspapers printed names and crimes. Posters spread across states. Telegraph operators sent descriptions of fugitives from town to town. The frontier was turning into a giant network of hunters and hunted. If a criminal pulled the trigger in Texas, a bounty hunter in Kansas might already be riding for him. If an outlaw robbed a bank in New Mexico, his face could reach California before he ever crossed the border. And as civilization crept slowly across the desert, the madness only grew. Train companies demanded protection. Wells Fargo hired shotgun messengers, men who rode with trunks of gold and fired their double-barrel guns without warning. Banks put bars over their windows and hired hired gunmen to guard the night. Travelers refused to ride alone on the open road. Even the most innocent citizens carried revolvers tucked inside their coats. Children learned to shoot before they learned to read. Still, the outlaws did not fear the law. The law was slow, clumsy, tired, and outnumbered, but they feared one thing: the bounty hunters. They feared the shadowy riders who did not wear badges but carried death under their coats. They feared men who would chase them across mountains, through deserts, into hell itself if the reward was right. These hunters worked outside the system, answering to no command but money, and every criminal knew that a bounty hunter could appear anywhere at any moment. Poker player in a saloon could be watching. A stranger in a church could be waiting. A quiet man cleaning his horse might already know the outlaw's name, his crimes, and his price. It became psychological warfare. Outlaws spent their days looking over their shoulders, questioning every glance, every handshake, every silence. They trusted no one, not their gang, not their families, not their neighbors, because betrayal was profitable. The right whisper could earn a farmer a year's wages. The right secret could turn a poor rancher into a rich man overnight. And slowly, outlaws began to fall, some captured alive in dramatic gunfights, others brought in as lifeless bodies tied across saddles. Every hanging in the town square became a warning. Every dead outlaw displayed outside a sheriff's office was a message written in flesh and blood. This is what the bounty system delivers, but not every capture was clean. Not every hunter was a hero. Some took the system into darkness. Men appeared who didn't care about justice at all. They cared only about money. They didn't bother asking questions. They didn't worry about right or wrong. If they suspected a man was a criminal, they shot first. If someone resembled a face on a poster, that was enough. Rumors spread of innocent men killed in the name of reward, a tired traveler mistaken for a fugitive, a ranch hand shot because he shared the same scar as a wanted robber. These stories poisoned the land with anger. Mothers cried, families buried sons. Some sheriffs tried to stop rogue bounty hunters, but when a hunter killed the wrong man, who was there to punish him? The bounty poster only required proof, and a corpse was proof enough. If the body resembled the drawing, justice was paid. The frontier had always been violent, but now it was lawless greed wrapped in the clothing of justice. And the chaos reached its peak when bounty hunters began hunting each other. A hype, Bryce Outlaw became a prize not just for hunters, but for anyone desperate enough to fight for the reward. Men ambushed other hunters, stole their prisoners, and delivered the bodies themselves. Men fought in the streets over captured criminals like wolves tearing at a single piece of meat. The government tried to control it, but gold was louder than the law. Still, bounty hunters kept riding. They accepted danger, they accepted loneliness, they accepted death. Many died on the trail, their bones abandoned in desert sands. Many vanished, never heard from again, but some survived long enough to become legends, men whose names still echo through time. There was Wild Bill Hickok, a gunfighter who left a trail of enemies behind him. He hunted horse thieves, killers, and robbers, and though he wore a badge at times, his true loyalty was to justice delivered by the barrel of a gun. There was Billy Dixon, who rode through Comanche territory, tracking outlaws through lands where even the army feared to enter. There was Pat Garrett, the man who would become famous, some say infamous, for hunting Billy the Kid. Most hunters, however, were ghosts. Their names never made history. They lived violently, died young, and disappeared into the soil with no grave and no memory. The West was not kind to those who served it. As the frontier expanded, bounty hunting collided with another force, industries rising from dust and sand. The railroad brought trade, settlers, guns, goods, and opportunity, but it also brought a fortune for criminals to steal. Train robberies became more common, and the rewards soared. Some outlaws robbed entire railway cars of gold and cash meant for banks and cities. They hijacked locomotives, derailed cars, and killed without hesitation. These criminals were not street bandits. They were military-level strategists. They studied timetables, bribed employees, and struck with speed and precision. Train companies, terrified and losing millions, paid bounties so large they could change a man's entire life. And when numbers rise, greed multiplies. Every bounty hunter in the West sharpened his knives and loaded his guns, knowing that one successful capture could snap years of poverty in half. The war between outlaws and hunters became a bloody competition. A train could travel hundreds of miles in a single day, but a bounty hunter could travel faster. He didn't need tracks. He didn't need stations. He only needed a trail, a set of hoof prints, or a rumor whispered in a saloon. Hunters followed bandits into frozen mountains, burning deserts, blinding blizzards, and tribal lands. More than one hunter was found dead with arrows in his back. More than one outlaw was left unburied in the dust. Yet something strange was happening beneath the violence. Civilization was slowly winning. Each captured outlaw meant one less threat. Each hanged killer meant one less terror. Towns grew safer. Banks stayed open. Families slept without listening for hoofbeats in the night. The bounty system, brutal and flawed, was working. It brought stability where the law had failed. It gave courage to frontier settlers who once lived in fear. It allowed sheriffs to breathe, knowing they were not alone in the fight. And while violence continued, many began to dream of a peaceful future. Children attended schoolhouses instead of hiding under beds. Churches filled with singing instead of silent prayer. Railroads connected cities. Telephones began to whisper across wires. The frontier was changing, slowly, painfully, but undeniably. But every time peace seemed close, the West reminded everyone that its heart was still wild. There were nights when the sky glowed red from burning barns. There were days when the thunder of gunfire echoed across valleys. Every quiet sunrise could be shattered by the roar of a train exploding into dust. Civilization was rising, but chaos refused to die. And in the middle of it all, bounty hunters continued their strange mission, men without uniforms enforcing the law of a growing nation. They were invisible until the moment they struck. They rode alone, slept with one eye open, trusted no one and carried the weight of every death on their conscience. Some became hardened, some became monsters, some became broken beyond repair, but they continued because the West demanded it. Then, slowly, the country began to tame the frontier. More towns became cities, more sheriffs gained deputies, territories became states, judges built courts, governments strengthened, and with each new piece of civilization, the bounty system shifted from survival to strategy. It remained necessary, but no longer wild, no longer unchecked, no longer a game of chaos. The power of bounty hunting began to fade. Outlaws who once rode freely now faced organized law enforcement. Detectives replaced informers. Wanted posters turned into legal documents with fingerprints and photographs. Horses gave way to railroads, and railroads gave way to telegrams and telephones. The West, once ruled by gun and grit, slowly surrendered to structure and order. But it did not vanish. Every time a bank was robbed, every time a murderer escaped, every time a criminal fled into the wilderness, the old system rose again. Bounty hunters still rode out, their guns heavy, their eyes sharp, their loyalty tied to justice and reward. Some historians say the bounty system saved the West. Others say it corrupted it. But no one can deny this simple truth. Without bounty hunters, the frontier would have drowned in blood long before civilization arrived. Their world was harsh, their choices were deadly, their lives were short, but they carved the path that allowed ordinary people to build new lives in a land once ruled by fear. And though the golden age of bounty hunting was ending, its legacy would never be forgotten. Because the story of the West was not just a story of pioneers and cowboys. It was a story of men who hunted evil across a land too wild to tame. The frontier was dying, but its spirit was alive. And somewhere out there, a wanted poster still fluttered in the wind. The frontier was fading, but the violence did not die with it. As towns grew into cities and the dusty roads turned into rail lines, the outlaw became a different kind of creature, less visible, less predictable, and far more dangerous. He blended into the growing population, disappeared into crowded saloons, hid behind polite smiles and fine clothing. Crime was no longer always committed under the open sky. It slithered into banks, hotels, rail stations, and busy markets. Civilization changed the rules, but it could not erase greed. And where there was crime, bounty hunting did not vanish. It transformed. The old bounty hunter of the desert, ragged, sunburned, and armed with a revolver, slowly gave way to hunters who were trained, organized, and calculated. Some worked openly for the government, some worked in the shadows, some still traveled alone through mountains and plains, but others were now part of agencies and detective networks. They studied patterns, followed paper trails, and tracked criminals using intelligence rather than just instinct. Yet the echoes of the Old West still haunted every bounty hunter alive. The rules were changing, but the dangers remained. Anyone who hunted a wanted man knew that a bullet could still end the story. A knife in the night could stop their heart, beat forever. The price of justice remained blood. In this new age came one of the most unforgettable pursuits in American history, the hunt for Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, leaders of the Wild Bunch, men whose robberies were so daring and so brilliant that newspapers published their crimes the way others reported ghost stories. These were not drunken outlaws or desperate farm boys. They were masterminds. They studied train schedules, bribed employees, and built a network of hideouts stretching across states. They moved faster than the law. They planned with military precision. Every robbery was a spectacle, explosions ripping open safe cars, gunmen moving like soldiers, horses waiting in hidden valleys for a clean escape. It was crime as strategy, not impulse. And the government had finally learned that the frontier's new criminals required new hunters. No single sheriff could stop men like this. No small town deputy could chase them across hundreds of miles. So the powerful companies, terrified of losing fortunes to train robbery, hired the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. The Pinkertons were not cowboys. They were detectives, intelligent, relentless, and trained to hunt the way wolves stalk prey. This was the next evolution of bounty hunting, no longer just men with guns and guts. Now tracking involved investigation, espionage, coded messages, and undercover informers hidden inside gangs. The Wild West was becoming a battlefield of minds as much as bullets. But the push for justice came with a darker shadow. Companies and governments became willing to pay almost anything to protect their money. Some detectives planted spies inside outlaw hideouts. Others paid informants who betrayed their friends in exchange for reward money. Rumors spread of false accusations, planted evidence, and men framed simply because someone wanted a bounty. The system, powerful as it was, never escaped corruption. Even then, the old kind of bounty hunter did not entirely vanish. Deep in the desert, along the lonely borderlands, and across the wide cattle trails, there were still men who rode the way bounty hunters always had alone, silent and deadly. These men knew that the new world of detectives would not reach the deepest wilderness. Out there, justice still belonged to whoever was fastest on the draw. There were hunters whose names were never printed in books. They were ghosts slipping in and out of towns with dust on their boots and wanted posters folded in their saddlebags. Some hunted for righteous cause. Some hunted because they enjoyed the chase. Some hunted because killing an outlaw paid better than honest work. And some were outlaws themselves, criminals who turned on their own partners, delivering them dead to sheriffs to wipe away their own sins. The border between good and evil was a thin, fading line. Justice wore a mask, and who it protected depended on who had the gold. But despite corruption, despite danger, despite blood spilled on every trail, the impact of bounty hunting was undeniable. Families who once lived in fear saw outlaws disappear. Ranchers who once lost cattle to thieves watched the roads grow safer. Stagecoaches traveled without ambush. Banks locked their vaults without whispering prayers. Life became possible in places that had once been unlivable. Schools were built where gunfights had once filled the night. Courthouses replaced saloons as the places where justice was decided. Still, the price of that progress was heavy. Every outlaw hanged in the town square was a human being whose life ended in front of silent crowds. Every body dragged into a sheriff's office was a reminder that peace was built on violence. Some bounty hunters retired rich. Others disappeared, buried beneath anonymous dirt. Some became sheriffs themselves. Others were shot in the back by men seeking revenge. And yet, the world kept turning. The frontier tightened. New states joined the Union. The telegraph carried news faster than any horse. Railroads connected coast to coast. The need for wandering gunmen faded as professional law enforcement grew stronger. Judges gained power. Courts gained structure. Evidence became more important than rumor. Civilization no longer relied on a drawing pinned to a wall to track a killer. Now there were names, records, files, law built on paper instead of pistol smoke. But the legacy of bounty hunting did not end, it changed form. When the American West began to fade into history, the bounty hunter did not fade with it. He simply evolved. Cities created official positions for tracking fugitives. Governments hired professional trackers and marshals. The word bounty hunter became fugitive recovery agent, marshal, or private detective. The mission was the same: find the outlaw, bring him in, bring justice to those he harmed. By the early 1900s, a new kind of criminal terrorized the land, the last of the great train robbers, the last gunslingers, the last desperados of the Old West. They rode fast horses and carried rifles, but they could not outrun the advance of civilization. Telephones replaced telegraphs, automobiles replaced horses, police departments replaced town marshals. The world was changing, and the outlaws ran out of places to hide. One by one, these final criminals fell. Some in shootouts, some arrested quietly in their sleep, some betrayed by partners, some handing themselves over because the frontier no longer had room for men like them. The bounty posters grew fewer. The rewards shrank. The hunters retired or died. But even when the dust of the West had settled, its shadow lingered. The American imagination never forgot the chase, the posters fluttering on wooden walls, the gunfights under burning skies. Western novels, silent films, and later Hollywood movies turned real men into legends. Cowboys and outlaws became symbols of freedom, danger, rebellion, and justice. Songs were written. Stories were passed from generation to generation. The West became myth, but a myth built on truth. Even today, reward money still exists. Fugitives still run. Hunters still follow. Modern bounty hunters wear suits instead of spurs, drive cars instead of horses, use computer databases instead of dusty maps. They track criminals through cities, airports, and highways, not deserts. They work with warrants, paperwork, and law enforcement agencies. But in their hearts, they are no different from those old riders who chased outlaws across the plains. A bounty remains a promise. Bring the wanted man home, alive if possible, dead if necessary. And there are still places in America where the echoes of the Old West whisper in the wind. In deserts and mountains, abandoned mines, ghost towns, broken saloons with shattered windows, bullet holes in walls that have stood for 150 years. Sometimes travelers swear they can feel it, the ghost of the frontier, the spirit of the hunter, the memory of gunfire swallowed by the earth. Every stone carries a story. Every rusted horseshoe has a past. Every grave hidden beneath wild grass might belong to a nameless man who died chasing justice or running from it. And the land remembers. The story of bounty hunting is the story of a country struggling to create order out of chaos. It is the story of how civilization crawled across mountains and deserts, fighting tooth and nail to survive. It is the story of ordinary men and women living through extraordinary danger. It is the story of criminals who believed freedom was worth any price, and the hunters who believed justice was worth any war. Justice in the West was not clean. It was not gentle. It was born from fire and fear. And while history books speak quietly about governors and treaties and railroads, the truth is that the West was tamed by blood, bone, sacrifice, and the relentless pursuit of law, even when the law was carried by a man without a badge. Today, when people imagine the Wild West, they think of cowboys riding into the sunset, heroes with silver revolvers, and outlaws wearing masks. But the real West was far more brutal, far more human, and far more tragic. It was a land where survival mattered more than honor, where courage was often just another name for desperation, and where men hunted men not because they wanted to, but because the world demanded it. Yet with all its violence, the West gave birth to a nation. The chaos eventually broke, replaced by towns, cities, roads, schools, and courts. The bounty hunter, in his own bloody way, helped carve the path. He was the bridge between savagery and civilization, the sword that cut through the darkness when there was no other blade sharp enough to do it. That is why his story matters, because without him, the frontier would have devoured the innocent and left nothing but death behind. Without him, the law would have collapsed under the weight of cruelty. Without him, the American West would never have stopped being a battlefield. Many of these hunters died forgotten. No monuments, no graves, no songs, but the land they bled for stands today in every quiet street, every peaceful ranch, every family that can sleep without fear. Their ghosts may not speak, but the silence they earned does. And somewhere, in museums and archives, surviving bounty posters still hang, yellowed paper, faded ink, names long forgotten, faces drawn in rough charcoal lines. They are artifacts of a world where justice was handwritten, where violence was currency, and where a single sheet of paper could decide the fate of a man. The bounty system was the backbone of frontier justice. It was ruthless, it was flawed, it was often unfair, but it worked when nothing else did. And in the end, that is why the West survived. Long after the gunsmoke faded, long after the last wanted poster curled into dust on a peeling saloon wall, the memory of America's most reckless bounty age lived on in whispers, diaries, dusty newspaper ink, and the trembling voices of those few, still breathing, who lived through it. Some stories survived only in legend, others buried in forgotten graveyards where wooden markers leaned crooked under desert winds, carved with names of men who chased justice or ran from it. The era of the bounty man had not simply disappeared. It had been swallowed by time, blurred by Hollywood fantasy, and tamed by polite history books. But reality was harsher, stranger, and far more complicated. The bounty hunter was not the gleaming hero of the silver screen. Many were drifters, some were heroes, some were butchers, and some were men who simply couldn't be anything else. Their lives, their choices, and their regrets lingered long after the last outlaw swing. The West did not begin as a place of law. It became one. In the early days, when towns were little more than rough planks hammered into dust, when mail took months and justice took years, bounty hunters filled the vacuum. The government wrote laws, but the land wrote its own. A lawman could ride for days and find nothing but sagebrush and silence, but a bounty hunter, well, he was paid to reach into that silence and drag out the men who tried to vanish into it. Even when civilization crept in railroads, telegraphs, polished law offices, many of the old hunters refused to change. Civilization didn't suit them. Cities were too crowded, too polite, too full of eyes. They felt more at home in the smell of raw leather and dust, in the sound of coyotes yipping under the moon, in the solitude of endless plains. One by one, they became relics walking among men who no longer understood them. The newspapers stopped printing stories about them. Children no longer collected their names like legends whispered behind barn doors. Townspeople began to frown at their dust-covered saddles, their scars, the cold quiet in their eyes. Once celebrated, many became unnerving reminders of a past everyone wanted to forget. A generation later, some of the last bounty men became deputies, sheriffs, or marshals, trying to trade outlaw blood for peace. Others died in saloons, shot by youngsters chasing glory. Some vanished entirely, fading into the mountains or deserts, leaving behind only rumors told around campfires. You could ride a whole lifetime and never know the bones beneath your horses. Hooves once belonged to a man whose name terrified half a continent. But the West was changing. Fences cut the open range, cities rose where buffalo once thundered, iron tracks slithered across plains old hunters believed should have stayed wild. With every whistle of a train, a page of the frontier turned. Even the most stubborn bounty hunter could feel the world shifting beneath his boots. The job was drying up. Cheyenne, Tombstone, Dodge, Abilene towns, once crawling with desperados, were swept clean. The gunslingers weren't bold enough anymore. The frontier wasn't free enough anymore. The era of chasing ghosts across endless wilderness was ending, yet the memory persisted because the West had never been just a place. It was a story, a fever in the blood, a dream carved out of madness and dust. The bounty men had chased more than criminals. They chased meaning, identity, redemption. Some, like the hardened trackers with eyes like cracked stone, hunted because they hated evil. Others hunted because danger was the only thing that ever made their hearts feel alive, and some hunted because they had no choice. When a man has killed enough, even for the law, he starts to wonder what part of him is still worth saving. Generations later, scholars would argue over their nature. Were they heroes, mercenaries, assassins, vigilantes? The truth was stranger. They were all of these at once. They were necessary, but never noble. Without them, many frontier towns would have been swallowed by chaos, robbed of cattle, gold, lives, and futures. But with them came a wild justice no courtroom could contain. The very best of them tried to bring men back alive, because dead bodies rarely told the truth. The worst of them shot first, then pinned a poster to the corpse afterward, convincing themselves it was close enough. Some crossed lines so often that no one remembered which side they started on. There were bounty hunters so vicious that outlaws feared them more than the gallows, and bounty hunters so honorable that even criminals shook their hand on the way to prison. Their stories were reminders of a time when survival meant walking a razor's edge. Civilization would never fully understand them, but the land remembered. The canyons where bullets once echoed still held their secrets. The saloons where men wagered their souls became museums or restaurants. The jails where outlaws waited for dawn became historical attractions, and in some forgotten corners, a rusted badge or a bullet-pocked wanted poster still lay buried in the dust. What surprised many historians was how deeply bounty hunting shaped the American law system that came after it. The Bureau of Investigation, what would become the FBI, studied the methods of the best frontier trackers. They learned about informants, disguises, coded messages, sting operations. They learned that criminals adapt, and lawmen must adapt faster. The Wild West was a brutal teacher, and modern justice learned well. Even the American idea of the hero was born in those untamed days. Newspapers made legends of ordinary men, sometimes to sell papers, sometimes to lift the nation's spirit. When people were scared, they needed to believe there were men willing to ride into danger. In truth, many of those so-called heroes were flawed, violent, or haunted, but people needed myth more than fact. They still do. Hollywood took those stories decades later and polished them, sanding away the blood, the fear, the dirt, and turning bounty hunters into clean-cut knights with perfect aim and unwavering morality. The real West was nothing like that. The real bounty man didn't fire warning shots. He didn't talk in poetic one-liners. He didn't stand glowing in the sunset. He slept in caves, drank water from horse tracks, dug bullets out of his own flesh with a heated knife, and prayed his horse wouldn't break a leg 50 miles from the nearest town. The movies forgot the hardest truth. The Wild West did not care who was good or bad. It only cared who survived, and yet that era left behind something priceless. Stories of courage and cruelty, of justice and vengeance, of men who dared to hunt monsters even while they risked becoming one themselves. When a bounty hunter looked a killer in the eyes, he sometimes saw his own reflection staring back. It terrified some, it thrilled others, but time, as always, erased them. Names that once commanded fear became footnotes in dusty records. Young Americans grew up never knowing that their great-grandfather might have once ridden with a star on his chest or a warrant in his pocket. The nation moved on, but history, real history, never forgets. Even today, every time someone watches a Western film, every time a child plays cowboy, every time a historian opens a brittle leather journal that smells of smoke and time, those old ghosts stir. The West lives again. The gallop of horses, the clang of spurs on wooden floors, the fluttering of a wanted poster in desert wind, it all returns. You can still visit the graves of bounty men if you know where to look. Some lie in proud cemeteries under marble headstones engraved with titles like Marshal or Texas Ranger. Others rest in unmarked soil known only to coyotes and the roots of thirsty mesquite trees. A few lie side by side with the criminals they once pursued, because gunfights don't care what side you're on. Death levels every score. Modern historians have tried to measure them, to categorize them, to decide whether the bounty hunter was a force of good or evil. The answer, like everything in the West, depends on where you stand. Ask a sheriff, and he'll tell you the bounty man kept order when lawmen were too few. Ask an outlaw's widow, and she'll say bounty hunters were paid murderers. Ask a historian, and she'll say they were tools of an evolving justice system. Ask the land itself, and it will remain silent, because the land has seen worse. So what remains of that age? Maps with ghost towns, museums filled with guns that once spoke louder than law, rusted shackles, faded journals, lead slugs dug from canyon walls, bones, lots of bones, but beyond artifacts there is a deeper legacy, an eternal question that the frontier carved into the American identity. What is justice worth? Who protects the innocent when law collapses? And what happens to a man who lives too long in the gray space between punishment and protection? Those questions shaped the country then, and in many ways they still echo today. The Wild West teaches a lesson that history books often soften. Justice is not born perfect. It is forged, sometimes violently, sometimes clumsily, by flawed men in desperate times. The bounty hunter was a product of that desperation. Without courts, without police, without prisons, justice had to ride on horseback, armed.